Hello and welcome to Malcolm Show, episode 9. Today I'm talking about a few different things. My notes cover social lives as emotional crutches when regulated unhealthily, sympathetic mental health, unproductive fun being empty, just like empty calories and empty neurochemicals, a bit like alcohol doesn't really do much for your health, streamable reality, making life a game, algorithmic currents being similar to electric currents, water currents, and wind currents to some extent, and something I've noticed with algorithms, how they exploit political affiliations and affinities to use identity politics as a divide and conquer tactic. So, without further ado, we'll start with the first note, we'll work through them, and then when I feel I've covered most of the meat of the matter, we'll see if there's any veg to cover as well, and then we'll see if there's a bit of a free flow of thought and see what we find. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of social lives as an emotional crutch. Now, the reason I say this is because I find that social lives, and I'm saying this from, because when I wrote this down originally, I wrote it in such a way that I felt I was definitely in a lonelier position. So, what the view I had at it, because I didn't feel quite as emotionally connected to my friends as I had done before, is I also didn't feel very lovable. And I think the point I'm trying to make here is that the emotional crutch of any relationship, to me, it's a perspective of. Also, I should note I'm starting from level 4 today rather than level 1. I'm stepping up my game a little bit because I figure if I take a little bit more time, think it out rather than rush through the chess, one, I'll get slightly better at chess, and two, I might have a better train of thought, and two, I might notice some new patterns. So the emotional crutch thing, I just kind of. Something I've always noticed with myself is that when I don't have other people in my life, I feel far more productive because there's less distractions. I don't have to worry about looking after persons A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or H. I can just go. I can plan my life with such a rigid structure that it becomes a routine that I can just perfect day after day after day, and everything just becomes simpler. I step it up to level 4 from level 1 and they hang the queen by move 9. Anyway, interesting. Episode 9 as well. Moving swiftly on, I just find it quite interesting that whenever I'm spending time with any other human being, and this is stuff that I've thought in my head and I've written it down, and it makes perfect sense from that perspective. And saying it out loud almost feels like there's a filter barrier wanting to interfere with what I'm saying, and it's in some ways that's kind of true. It's almost as if I don't want to say it out loud because when I say it out loud, I won't be able to retract it, especially given this format theoretically immortalizes what I'm saying forever. So the problem I encounter is that when I spend time with people, no matter how close the relationship is, either by my perception, their perception, or simply because we spent that much time together, it's kind of obvious that we are quite close. I almost feel that it holds me back from accomplishing other goals. And in some ways that's true because the sacrifices that have to be made to maintain a relationship often mean that the expense of maintaining the relationship is at to the detriment of other stuff. So for instance, I recently had to dial back a little bit on boxing and kickboxing simply because the gym moved away, so it was a bit further away, and it started meaning I would spend more time in the car driving, which ultimately meant it was costing more money. And little things like I don't know, I just noticed bits of head trauma and stuff, and having seen people in it for such a long time, I like my brain. I want to keep my brain till I'm very old. I want it to work well for my entire life. And if I'm quite honest, one of the things that scares me most in the entirety of things that I know of, the known knowns, is losing my mental faculty. So it's one of the reasons I make such an effort to study things like chess and languages and maths and psychology and sociology and all these various things that I feel all interlinked together and I can translate them in my head and find all these new perspectives, combine them, and produce something that's actually worthwhile and interesting. And I just feel that when I'm communicating with people, and it's not in the format of a colleague in a work format, or to a teacher or as a teacher in an academic format or studying, or if I'm at training with a coach or a training partner, or anything in a somewhat similar format, being able to communicate in a way that I feel it's really weird. It almost feels like the concept of profit. Because if I'm at work and I'm speaking to them about work, it helps the business work smoother. If I'm in an academic environment, a school, a college, an academy, whatever it is, like an academy, a college, a school, university, I'm going to use the word school as the broad term, or educational facility, just say school. If I'm speaking about something that enhances my understanding of the subject matter of the topic at hand, then that feels productive. It feels like it's actually going somewhere. It actually feels like a sensible idea. Meanwhile, if I spend time and I'm talking about, let's say for example, I've got colleagues or classmates or training partners or anybody in that regard that when I communicate to them, I might learn like one or two things versus three or four things, and it's like it's a concept I have in my head of self improvement, and it's similar to the idea in a business of return on investment. It's like I could continue selling the same products over and over and over again, like communicating the same ideas, and I might get a few extra customers. I might be able to work slightly less, which means I'm getting paid slightly more per hour and all that. Or I could get new products and sell, I can still keep the old products and sell them to existing customers. It doesn't mean I can't also add new products and services to my business. And if I add new products and services to my business, or I add new concepts, ideas, and theories, and all that, basically synonymous word for idea to my academic endeavors, aspirations, ambitions, then I'm going to get a better return on it. For example, if I was in high school speaking about psychology stuff, we'd probably go over basics of behaviorism and it would all be quite straightforward. At the college level, it's mostly A level stuff in a slightly more mature environment. At the university level, my understanding of behaviorism, I don't know yet how far that goes. Pardon me. I don't yet know if my understanding of behavioral conditioning and behaviorism generally will be above or below the average there. So, because it's one of my favorite things, but well, if I can get good at it, then at least I know that when I get there, I'll be as well prepared as I can be, and then I can establish what the baseline is and work from there. So, it's whenever I'm communicating with somebody in a sense that's not hyper productive, and that's the thing, it's like it could be ordinarily productive, and I can be super productive. Where's the opportunity for hyper productivity? It's like right now I've got the OK move that seems like a move because it hits the check. Is there a better move? Because hitting the check forces the king to move. It means that the rook is then stuck in the corner and the king can't castle. It blocks in that bishop. So that's actually, there is a lot of utility to that move there. Also, that rook can't move until the king moves. So then what? So if I do that and he moves here, then what? What's the follow-up? And that's the idea. That's kind of where I want to go with this, because sometimes I feel in conversations with people, in communication generally, I feel that sometimes when I'm talking to people, I have to like dance around their feelings. Like, the expression I've heard before is walking on eggshells, and I get that, and I often feel I don't want to pretend to be smarter than I am. My IQ's been measured in apparently what's genius range, and these are online tests, and I did like 10 of them, and they were always high. I think the lowest I've ever scored is 130, and the highest was, I remember 170 for a while, and I remember the highest being closer to 180 or over 180. The point stands is I know I'm not an idiot, and that's the only real takeaway from this, because I think IQ is a really useful metric of intelligence. I think most people that dismiss IQ as a useful metric generally aren't appreciating how much value it has. It doesn't make you smart, it makes you good at understanding. It means you can translate concepts in your head. It means anytime you start something new, the likelihood of you picking up the basics of it quickly are very, very quick. And I think it's similar to the idea that when you're passionate about something, you just want to do it, you just want to understand. Your brain is able to do that quicker because it just is. It's like a genetic potential. Some people are better at sprinting than others, some people are better at strongman events than others. So there will be biological aspects, I'm sure, as well, which predispositions people to be better at skill work based sports. Probably stuff like IQ, there will be a biological component to that. And I'm just going to explore the thought, and if it sounds controversial or insulting or offensive or upsetting or whatever negatively connotating synonym you can have attached to it, fine, it'll be what it is, and I'll deal with it later. I don't think I'm the smartest person that's ever lived. I know I'm definitely not going to be the smartest person that's ever lived. That's not the point here. The tricky thing is in my local environment, I have yet to encounter many people that I can actually have a full-fledged conversation with that can span the breadth, the depth, and every other metric of measurement you want to measure a conversation by. That I can think of two people off the top of my head that I can really have deep, proper conversations with, and of those two, one of them I would feel is a bit smarter than the other. And the thing is, there's a specialization aspect to it as well, because a lot of time the stuff I want to talk about is like biology, psychology, sociology based, or at least that's where the origin of my perspective comes from, because that's what I've been focusing on recently. It's what I find interesting because of how universally applicable it is. It's I just find it really useful, and trying to translate that into what I call the technological perspective. So, for example, stuff like like for cyber psychology communication, so stuff like algorithms and coding, computer science, digital technologies generally, I find it's a really useful idea because once you start realizing that art, code is art first and foremost before it becomes a science. It's just the human mind expressing itself, and all art is just a reflection of self. So every time we read code, whether it's in its original format, so I might be able to inspect element to, yeah, but you can read code like that and see all the various elements on the page as they get highlighted and stuff, or you can read the product of the code on the other side. It's the scene in the Matrix where Cypher's talking to Neo, the computer. He can read the code so well, he just sees it as the chessboard that we've got here. It's like once you understand the concept well enough, you're not being overwhelmed by jargon and terminology. It's, I guess it's synonymistic. You're just understanding it for what it is. And the tricky thing is, like, sometimes I understand something well enough that I can explain it in, to me, with the complexities of how I have to understand it, of how I understand it to explain it, and then simplifying that is what I find difficult. And the thing is, there are some things in the world which are so complex it's hard to explain them simply. However, I think that's one of the signs of intelligence is being able to reduce complexions to simplicities. For example, in chess, is like a really good chess player is going to be fairly intelligent because of the difficulty subscribed to it. You can work as hard as you want. There's still a level of intelligence. I'm sure if you measure the IQ of all the world champions and every player who's ever been in the top five, the average IQ will, I would bet, £1 billion sterling, the average IQ of every chess world champion and top five ranked player since the inception of the World Championship, and William Stein has got it, that it would be above average. Definitely globally, and perhaps even in their countries of origin. Definitely globally. I'm not going to speculate too much on the countries of origin thing, that's a divergent topic. And weirdly, all reminds me of the whole identity politic algorithm thing. And it just feels that when I'm communicating to people, I have to slow down so much, which I really enjoy teaching. And I was a climbing instructor for 4 years. I've taught quite a bit of stuff just to, so at work I'm one of the older people, And it's stuff like life lessons that just like seem like obvious principles to me because I've lived through it and somebody else taught me beforehand. So I sort of realized, oh, hang on, if I'm one of the older people, then I have to start setting the example and leading by example and teaching. So taking all that on board, and I actually really like it. It's a really interesting balance between feeling good about yourself because you do genuinely know what you're talking about, and gently nudging them, gently just, you know, probing with questions and seeing what they understand and how they understand it, where their perspective is coming from. And it is really interesting in that regard. So, with that in mind, my use of the term emotional crutches is what I wrote down on my phone is the idea that emotions can often feel useless. Like the productivity of emotions is really difficult to quantify because the warm fuzzies you get from affection and attention and love and all these words that sort of give us the happy fuzzies. Why do we need the happy fuzzies to feel good about ourselves when we can do all these other things in our lives which make us feel good in a disciplined manner? And the thing is that there's a phrase I quite like is you can either suffer the pain of discipline or you can suffer the pain of regret. And I'd much rather choose to suffer the pain of discipline. And the thing is, I can hear a friend's voice in my head right now saying, "What? Why are they mutually exclusive? You don't just because the person you're with occasionally makes you feel the pain of regret. It doesn't make it their fault. It means perhaps that you're not communicating to them the way you want to experience the relationship." And that friend is completely correct in this manner. And I think it's very good to actually assign credit where it's due. So it's a friend of mine I will have on the podcast. I've invited to have on the podcast and has agreed to be on the podcast. So the thing is, part of me says I don't want to spoil her privacy, and on the other hand, it feels like the other end, the polarity of my ego thinks, it's a name dropping. And it's like it's a friend of mine called Maya. She's very intelligent, and I enjoy her company very much because she elucidates things for me that I sometimes completely am oblivious to. So at some point, we'll organise that all together, and it'll be wonderful. In the meantime, I need to figure out, well, one, the sequence on the board, and two, why I feel emotional vulnerability to be a crutch. Because I do kind of enjoy being emotionally open with people. It can genuinely be quite enjoyable. It's just, I often feel that when emotionality is relied upon to such extent that, how do I phrase this? You don't get other stuff done because it almost, it can feel a little bit like babysitting sometimes. And I don't mean that with any particular person. I mean that in all relationships. That's just the way my mind interprets relationships. They all, like, so much of the time, I either feel as if I'm babysitting or I'm the babysitter. And I wouldn't mind that so much if. Ah, I don't want to feel like the babysitter. The trouble is sometimes is you're in the position where you simply are just more mature than the other person. However, how is the less mature person supposed to develop that maturity if they don't have a role model to learn from? And that's where I feel the responsibility to them during closer moments. Sort of like, one, be a good role model, two, fulfill the responsibility of my participation in the relationship, three, fulfill my own internal ideation of self. For example, rather than just being who I am, it's who I want to become, because the person I want to become is caring and empathetic and patient and all of that. And I like being those things. I think those are qualities worth striving for. I also feel that if my relationships if my relationships occur in such a way where I only get those things by insisting upon them, is that because the dynamic of the relationship is such a way that I'm just in charge and in control, and that's something I live with? Or is there more to the relationship than that? Because if I'm going to be in charge and in control forever, that's a lot of energy. However, how dissimilar is that to being a parent? It's not something you can choose to do temporarily. Once you're a parent, you're a parent. Until you die or the kid dies, which, hopefully happens one way round rather than the other, what really is there to do? You just do your best and hope that the kid understands you're doing your best. And the tricky thing is, I feel weird for describing some of my relationships as being. I prefer to frame it as being a parent or rather than a babysitter because that feels more respectful. It's also bells. When did I talk about bloody hanging queens as well? I got blinded by the checkmate. Part of me likes the responsibility because of the power that comes with it. Because there is something satisfying about having that power dynamic where I'm in charge, what I say goes, I get to basically do whatever I want. And the thing is I don't even feel like I'm being. I know I'm not being malicious with it because every time I exert power, I'm doing it in a way that is for their best benefit as far as I can tell. And I realize that's a subjective input. However, it's things like. No, okay, it's going to start divulging my personal life now. It is what it is. Things like encouraging the cessation of smoking, encouraging reading, writing, improving your diet, improving your exercise regime, just generally improvement, things like that, and whatever level the other person is at, just being helpful rather than judgmental. So, for instance, to me, it doesn't matter if you're an Olympic level athlete or if you've never stepped foot inside a gym before. To me, it's a really interesting problem to solve. Is, well, what is the most appropriate way for you to, you know, get on that bandwagon, as it were? You want to lose weight or you want to improve, you just want to improve your health. I know how to do that in several ways. Let me help you. And the thing is, I am a qualified personal trainer, and yet I all, I weirdly don't feel super comfortable accepting payment for it. Because it's something I don't think I'd rather do it for free. I just, when money gets involved, it alters the dynamic of the relationship, and I feel like the emotional relationship that evolves from it is just kind of, it can be authentic. However, for whatever reason, if one of them can't afford to see you anymore, then you might want to continue seeing the other person and it simply can't because of a financial barrier. And that just sucks. It really, really sucks. And I'm not sure how I feel about. How do I describe it? How do I describe it? That is the blooming question. Let's take that, see what the computer takes. Is then that it? What? See what I have to put up with. That's uh, checkerini. So do that, and then you're going to. There we go. Okay, so then we can do that. You go there, and I can. No, that'll hang the pawn. Bring this rook across. Sorry, I'm being a terrible host. I'm quite happy I managed to get so much time out of this first bit originally. It's just, I think what I find difficult about people is how needy they are. Just, why can't they be more like me? It's such a dickish thing to say. It's like, why isn't everybody like me and wanting to be just how I am all the time? I know it's unrealistic to expect other people to want to be like me. I also don't think it's infeasible, and I want to surround myself with more people that share my behavioral traits. It's just, how do I find those people when most of the people I want to surround myself with are in play? Where do I find them? Martial arts are quite good for that sort of thing. I found quite a few people there that I enjoy sharing the company of. Academia is going okay in that regard. There's many people that I feel will enjoy the endeavour of finding the truth rather than just whatever opinion is being spouted that day. What is the. How can I upgrade my social circle? And the thing is, it's not even that I dislike my social circle, I just know that I want more. And I don't really know how else to phrase that except it's you become you become a combination of the people you spend the most time around, which means there'll be people in my life I'm spending time around which are technically holding me back, and it's how do I walk away from them in a way that isn't hurtful, in a way that isn't that doesn't burn the bridge. It just, you know, sometimes you have to leave people behind though, and that's something that really hurts. I should probably go for the checkmate without trying to promote a pawn. That would be sensible. Anyway. Yeah, because you're dancing around the topic now, Malcolm. Hmm. So, do that. Sack the pawn. Apparently not taking that bait for whatever reason. And we got ourselves a ladder. Or we had a ladder of sorts. I'll go. I'll go. Go. Hmm. Because I think part of it is it's kind of like the idea of like beginner gains. So when I first sort of started the whole endeavor to improve my life, it was kind of obvious what I needed to eliminate. Like, for example, quitting smoking cigarettes and eliminating junk food and having a solid exercise regime and finding out stuff that I wanted to study rather than just pissing about on the internet and watching funnies and cartoons all day long. And bit by bit, I've kind of found that as I've made replacements here, like improving my diet, like having veggies more often than once a week and stuff like that, that's the simple stuff. It's what is the next step from it. And part of the reason I want to improve my social circle is because I feel that if I do it properly, then the people I surround myself with will be able to provide better insight into what I'm doing. Because many of the people I'm with, whilst they're helpful and I feel like I'm progressing, to put an arbitrary number upon it, it would be like at a 1% a day rate. I want to improve at 2% a day, 4%, 8, 16, 32, 64, 1 to 8% per day. Because I want, even if I find that level of growth initially overwhelming, I'm not going to get better at adapting to that acceleration of growth without diving into it, without trying. It's, if you don't make the attempt, how are you going to know whether you succeed? You can, oh yeah, I can do that, it's in my head, blah, blah, blah. And if you're an expert that's been doing it for a decade, you've probably got a reasonable idea of it. If you've never tried the thing before, how the bloody hell are you going to know what to do? And it's just, I'm trying more and more to understand what I want out of life. And the thing is, I get most of it now, and generally the person that's standing in my way is me. So if the person that's in my way is me, what am I doing to hold myself back that I don't realise? Because I said earlier, it's like people hold me back. I don't want to assign the blame to them. That's not fair and probably not even accurate. Because most of the time, people aren't intention. It's like, don't attribute to maliciousness what can be explained by ignorance. Some people aren't trying to hold you back. They're just doing their best, and their best simply isn't what you need. And I'm just wondering, what am I missing? It's the unknown unknowns, because how do I know what I don't know? It's That's why we study, isn't it? I am rushing through this analysis, but I have a theory about. Well, I can kind of half jump to streamable reality and explain this point. So I have this whole thing with streamable reality where it feels like whenever I put a video on, regardless of the streaming platform, like I kind of live through it in a interdimensional way. I don't know how best to explain that, so bear with us as I use the term interdimensional. As in, the video I will live through, let's say for example there's 3 people in the video, I will then start experiencing scenarios, whether it's at work, at school, training, or in my personal life, where there are 3 people together in a room. Or if I watch a video with 4 people together in a room, there's 4 people together in a room. And whatever happens in the video, there's a very, for me, easily interpretable layer of. It's. I'm not sure if there's a literary device to describe it, because it's not like it's an allegory or a metaphor or similar or anything like that. It just genuinely feels like a pre-programming thing. If you don't understand the term pre-programming, it's a kind of propaganda which basically conditions the population ahead. It's kind of like sociological conditioning. It gently eases the idea into the population before it happens. So, for instance, something that I'm very aware is happening is the pre-programming effects to soothe the idea of normalizing paedophilia, because things like the rebranding to minor attracted person. There's schools in the United States of America where some professors have actually tried to push this forward and have been fired for it. I remember there was a short-haired lady with glasses, specifically was in the picture. There's also legislation that's been passed in California which has decriminalized sexual misconduct with, I think it was 14-year-olds or something thereabout. So all these little things bit by bit. And the tricky thing is some people like myself see this stuff and I can communicate to them. It just, yeah, I see it, man. It's like there's a cartoon parade that was going on for Pride. I think it was 2021, maybe 2022 when it happened, that had a flag that's been specifically designated as what they call MAP, minor attracted person. That's happening. That's a thing. It's in the works. And the tricky thing is I've tried discussing this with people who, by all reasons, are good people, and they aren't shocked that this is happening. And honestly, one of my concerns is that in this day and age, which is the 4th of July in 2023, at almost exactly 6 p.m., 1800 hours, what I feel right now is a very commonly held viewpoint that adults should not sexualize minors. Prepubescent minors are not for sexualization. That's just not healthy in any way, shape, or form. My concern is, and then we're going through the whole political thing on the algorithms, is there'll be a normalization in the same way that if you go back far enough, and I'm trying to say this without wanting to sound controversial, I'm just stating the facts of it. There was a point in time where homosexuality was not just frowned upon, it was outright illegal. Then that became legalized, and then further rights were given to homosexual people and other members of the LGBT community. And then as it's moved forward and forward, there's just been, it's. I'm trying not to sound horrid about this because I don't want to be a dick. It's just, to me, it seems like if you follow that logic of what the conservative position was back then and what the conservative position is now versus what the liberal position was back then and what the liberal position now is, both sides are moving closer and closer towards the quote-unquote left-hand side of the spectrum. And then anything that's further from the left-hand side of the spectrum is being viewed as extremism, when in reality, if you go back 20, 30 years, maybe 50 years, 60 years, those were the commonly held beliefs, which means those are living memory. There are still people that hold, by the younger generation's viewpoint, extremist views because that's just how they were raised. It's like with Moore's law with technology, the acceleration of societal acceptance of, I'm going to use the term alternatives because I'm not really sure what other word to use there. It gets faster and faster, and the thing is, it's got to the point where if you make any sort of disagreement to the idea of anybody that isn't, of the disagreement to anybody that is within the politically correct spectrum of acceptability, you get cancelled. And it seems to me that if you go politically incorrect, even the slightest notion, it can destroy your entire livelihood as well as the livelihoods around you and those you care about. And it's infuriating because to me it predicts the idea that if you aren't able to do the Orwellian thing like Winston and just say exactly what you need to, how you need to say it, and find all the correct terminology and don't have any wrong thinking, yada yada yada. We're getting closer and closer to that because the algorithmic technology has developed in such a way that they know what we're thinking. It's just doesn't matter if it's a search engine from Alphabet. It doesn't matter if it's a security contractor that's keeping an eye on everything going on with your computer. It doesn't matter if it's a social media platform from Meta or Twitter. It doesn't matter if it's a streaming platform like Netflix or YouTube. I mean, the YouTube algorithm knows my thought patterns ridiculously well. And I wouldn't hesitate to say that any of the other brands I've mentioned know my thought patterns better perhaps than I understand them. And that would go for everybody that interacts with these platforms. So how long will it be until software is created to such extent that they can accurately predict all of our thoughts? Especially considering the accelerated progression at which technology is moving. It's just going to get faster and faster. You can't slow down that kind of progress because ultimately it's the concept of profit gets in the way, because the concept of profit isn't exclusive to the idea of making more money in the sense of dollars and pounds and rubles and yen. It's the idea of if you're learning more, you're making a knowledge profit. If your health is getting better and better, let's say for example you were morbidly obese and you go in fatty way, not bodybuilder way, if you and then reduce yourself to a healthy BMI with some muscle mass, and then you go a bit more muscle mass, bit better cardio, this, that, and the other, you're making conceptually a profit upon your health. And that's kind of the problem with the whole progression thing, is like once you understand it, you're either winning or losing. It becomes a very binary system in that regard. Kind of like with chess, you're either making a good move or a bad move. And it just feels that the longer we don't address the elephants in the room, well then the elephants are just going to settle into the room and do as they please. And if the elephants in the room are doing as they please, then the elephants in the room take over the room. And if the elephants in the room take over the room, then it's the elephant's room, not our room. And effectively the elephant has taken over. And then what? If the elephant's already taken over, we're kind of buggered, aren't we? So then the elephant's in charge and the elephant gets to decide everything. Which then makes me wonder, how much do we actually get to decide for ourselves? How much of what's going on from algorithmic conditioning is organically occurring? How much of it is, for example, if we go the dead internet theory route for a minute, dead internet theory is basically boils down to how the internet is so artificial because of the amount of bots on it that most trends that occur are actually not organic human interactions. They actually stem from bots speaking about things. So if, let's say for instance, a bot farm, doesn't matter what country it's in, any bot farm has got the agenda of the owner of the bot farm. So regardless of whether they have a Bricks or a Five Eyes affiliation, the point is, and see already there, and I feel like a divide and conquer thing. It's just some people do it for politics, some people do it for profit, some people do it for. I'm just trying to think of another way. I list them alphabetically because it's my own personal sorting system. It's I feel like I'm taking myself off topic, but I'm also trying to encourage myself to have a free flow of thought because then it connects the dots in my head, and to try and put this into a neuroscience perspective, it's like the actual potential of the neurons isn't necessarily going to change. However, the patterns of neural pathways that form will change depending on how we move them. So, say for example, you get better and better at developing a physical skill, then that physical skill will become something that you get better at, quite simply. In the same way that if you get better at understanding a subject or a topic, then your specialist skill increases quite vastly. Your generalistic skill will also improve alongside that because there will be generally applicable principles that, regardless of which way you're looking at it, will be useful. The generally applied principle of, for example, with people being polite, courteous, friendly, polite, respectful, it doesn't matter who you're speaking to. If you can find out how that person feels respected, then you communicate to them on their wavelength. And that's the general approach to what you might learn in specificity in a different context. And it's stuff like that that I've thought in my head before and just haven't put into words before. And it's one of the reasons I like doing this podcast is it sort of puts the train of thoughts on tracks. Right. I feel I've had a fairly healthy read into that one. So let's finish this evaluation fairly quickly because this is taking far longer than I intended. So maybe we'll have to split this over other notes. Maybe we will. Maybe we will. Du-du-du. I definitely dilly-dallied a bit with this one. Not terribly, I just got too insistent on... Oh, hang on, what's that? How did I miss that? Why isn't the rook just tut tut? Yeah. Well, the next topic up for discussion is something I describe as sympathetic mental health. So, it's kind of a self-explanatory title. I feel that mental health conditions have become such a prevalent idea that people are almost more concerned about feeling sympathy towards somebody who's been diagnosed with a condition than they are about actually treating the condition. So if it was like a physical malady, let's say for example somebody had cancer. Also, I do actually want to shout out today that it is the anniversary of my mum's death 11 years ago, and I just want to say I miss you. It feels like an emotional ploy for viewership. That it doesn't matter. Point stand is like, say for example you have cancer. Most people aren't able actually to like physically do anything about it. They can provide, comfort, prayers, thoughts, well wishers, all that sort of thing, which is, it helps to some degree. It creates a positive environment. That stuff does make a difference. It's quite well known. The tricky thing is if you don't actually know how to cure cancer, then all the well wishing in the world is how much good is it actually doing? Meanwhile, with mental health stuff, so much of it can be solved by people being better friends to each other, by being better human beings. Oh, goodness sake. By being better human beings to each other, we can actually help build each other up. And it's something I've noticed is a lot of times, like, some people don't like hearing that you're having a rough time. Some people just would rather bury their head in the sand and not hear about your troubles, because then maybe it reminds them of their own troubles. Maybe they're just not that empathetic towards you. Maybe they just simply don't care that much. Maybe the whole idea of being emotionally supported to them is such a foreign concept that it's difficult for them in a way that is actually really hard to explain. So one of the reasons I think I'm doing this podcast is I've realised it's quite therapeutic. So, for instance, the man who raised me he's done a fairly good job in many regards. He's not the most emotionally open person in the world, and that's fine. That's who he is. He's made efforts. I would say he can try harder, and it feels like he doesn't want to try harder because it's effort. However, from his perspective, maybe he doesn't know what to do, and maybe he feels that his son teaching him how to do that sort of thing isn't the way that parenting should go. He should be the one that's able to provide these answers from the get-go. And I think something like that, the simple idea of providing an empathetic perspective, is one of the major factors. I think if people were generally more empathetic towards each other, better friends, just more supportive generally, and were willing to spend a little bit of time, even just the tiniest bit of, how you doing, how's your day, and remembering the small details, I think most of the mental health profession would become completely redundant if people were better. And I think alongside that, part of the issue there is that people, how are they going to get better unless they're taught what being better is? You have to lead by example, right? The concept of better is quite vague in some ways. And if I want to do all the stuff I want to do tonight, I might have to stop this one somewhat soon. So we'll do this, and then we'll move on. Yeah, sympathetic mental health. I feel that some people, I don't know, and sometimes people kind of latch onto the idea of, it's not even that, it's, people will feel one way, and it's something I've noticed I do sometimes, is I empathise with people to such an extent that I can kind of feel what they feel. It's just not in a, I feel it biologically, I don't feel it emotionally. I'm not sure if I'm expressing that correctly. It makes sense in my head that I can understand from an objective perspective that they feel this way because of this, that, and the other. It's just, this is the thing I was saying on about the whole socialised being a crutch stuff. It's, your problems aren't complicated to solve, they're just difficult. It's actually, it might not be easy, it is simple. It's not complicated, it's just difficult. You just have to get on with it sometimes. You can't just hope somebody else is going to do it for you. There's no practicality to that. It'd be completely ridiculous. And thank God you actually saw that then. Okay. And I feel that's becoming an increasingly common theme with younger generations, because the convenience of technology has made their lives so much simpler than they were before. They almost take for granted the notion of stuff that people, I sound like a crotch Joe man when I say this, I'm sure. However, It's kids today take things for granted that we had to work for. They're not wrong. The saying it's not an unreasonable statement. There is a sense of entitlement in the younger generation, which I've already noticed, and I'm 29 in 3 months, 2.5 months. That's not that much. It really isn't that old in the modern day. I mean, you go back in time a little bit, yeah, maybe I'd have been one of the older people around. In the current day and age, that's not that old. And it's kind of alarming that I feel so old when I'm not really that old. It's just something I was saying about the whole Moore's Law accelerationism thing. It feels like it's applicable to everything. Like, the rate at which people are aging mentally is getting faster than it was before. Which, to some extent, you could argue is like the emotional maturity is being onset quicker because the access to the internet provides more information, and then because the previous generations have had more access to, such abundant resources, that every consequent development is amplified. It's bigger than it was because there's more going on. So, for instance, bother. If you grew up in the 80s, or the 70s or the 80s, say you grew up in the 60s before most computers were even a thing, and then there's you got the 70s where computers were still not really a thing except at NASA and other large organizations. Then you grew up in the 80s where some big businesses have them, it's not super common. The home computers were barely a thing. Then you get into the 90s, and all of a sudden the home computer becomes far more accessible. It's not unreasonable to have a home computer these days. It's maybe a slightly fancy thing. It's not actually that uncommon. So then, with that in mind, you get into the early 2000s, the early noughties. It having a home computer was actually pretty normal. It wasn't that big a deal. Kids at home had stuff like laptops. And then you get into the 2010s, smartphones become normal to the point where not having a smartphone was really rare. Really, really was. I don't know many people that didn't have it. I should say, in the Western world rather than worldwide. I mean, I'm actually not sure how many people outwith of Europe, North America, and East Asia, I suppose Australia, New Zealand, didn't have a smartphone. It was really, really common. And then it'll get to the point where worldwide, doesn't matter where you are, having a smartphone will be normal. Everybody will have a smartphone. Everybody. Oh, cock. When everybody has a smartphone, then the rate of information exchange just increases and increases and increases. And, well, you can say if people are getting smarter. I don't know that they are. It doesn't necessarily feel like people are getting smarter. It feels like people have better access to technology. And that better access to technology, it just means they've got more access to information. It's like when you can Google every answer, do you actually understand the topic, or are you just good at Googling answers? It's like the whole ChatGPT thing, the amount of people that use it to do their job for them already, and that's only been a widely known thing for a couple of years, maybe a few years. Yeah, say since 2020 at the earliest, really, because when that became mainstream knowledge. how many people have that computer doing the job for them that don't actually know how to do their job? And that's not going to decrease. If anything, employers are going to find a way for ChatGPT to do more of the work than the employee, and then eventually the employee is not going to have a job at all, and then stuff like the conversation around universal basic income is going to become a very significant talking point because it'll be necessary. It won't be unavoidable. It's not just going to be, you know, supermarket jobs and stuff that go out and it's like, oh well, it's just the poor. Who worries about them? It's going to be skilled workers. It's going to be people with university degrees. It's going to be people with master's degrees that will get to the point where doctorates become useless. That's the case of the matter. That's what it is. On what timescale? That's the tricky part. I'm not familiar enough with the technology to accurately predict this. I think we can safely say from some of the automation that we've seen already, such as in supermarkets and fast food restaurants, where much of the process, there's like self-checkouts everywhere, doesn't need that much human interaction. It really doesn't. And most of the time, you only interact with a human because you kind of wanted to interact with a human. You do it out of almost the need for socialization, which is that first thing, is social lives as an emotional crutch. Is, well, humans are kind of social creatures. We are probably more social than we really like to admit, especially, I know I am, far more social than I like to admit. And the thing is, like, for all that socializing, if it's changing to if the expense of productivity, and then that's the notion of a capitalistic infrastructure, isn't it? Because if the capitalistic infrastructure is what denotes who's worthwhile and who's useful, then unless you're able to create profit, you're not going to be kept in a job. And unless you can create more profit than something that's designed to, one, create profit as its pure output and doesn't need to eat, doesn't need hygiene, doesn't need to sleep, doesn't need any days off, anything like that, it's not going to have to worry about, it's never going to be late to work, it's never going to make a mistake unless the person who asked it to do something made the mistake wrong. And then eventually they'll get to the point where the person who asked the questions to the machine will be replaced by, or at least be consolidated to fewer and fewer people and perhaps replaced altogether. It's just tricky. Is this going to happen within the next 5 years, 10 years? On some levels, yes, it is. Is it going to happen in the next 20 years? What degree? I think that's when the university degrees will start becoming less and less useful. Genuinely, within the next 20 years, I think the university degree will not be seen as the powerful tool it's seen as now. Because it just isn't. And it really never was. It was never a metric of intelligence. It was a metric of an ability to follow instructions. Because if you can memorize information and write it all down, well done. You can memorize things. You've not necessarily understood the information well. That's not to say that the average university graduate isn't probably got a higher IQ than the average non-university graduate. It's difficult to say, isn't it? And it's difficult because to eventually it's the acceptance of that's how people are. There is going to be ego involved. There is going to be an emotional state which affects the way they behave. So how do you design a system that preserves people's dignity so that they don't feel that being replaced by a machine invalidates them? That's one of the trickier long-term things to solve. I really wish more people would understand that automation is coming far sooner than they realise. Within the next 20 years, university degrees will become maybe not obsolete. That's a strong word to use. 5 years, a university degree will be worth something. In 10 years, It'll be worth something. In 15 years, you'll start noticing the effects of it. In 20 years, the value of a university degree will start deteriorating. In 25 years, it'll be hard to recognise what the value of a university degree is when computers can do most everything. In 30 years, I think algorithms will have taken over. I really think that algorithms will have taken over to such an extent that there won't be much left to do except stuff like universal basic income. It'll be a necessity at that point, and trying to explain that to people who haven't yet clocked on is, oh, it's tricky. Because that means, theoretically, before I'm 60 years old, which, if we're being fair, I'm in good health in a first world country, and I've no pre-existing conditions that I'm aware of. My family health is quite good. I have access to the NHS, and there's not the worst healthcare available. Like, private healthcare is an option. That means 2/3 of my life, and then regardless of whether I want to work or not, I won't need to work because the system will have adapted. So how far will the system adapt? How far ahead of the curve are we? How far behind the curve are other people? Which I think in some ways makes, and I'm not trying to just like coping mechanism, defense mechanism any way out of this. I think it's one of the reasons I think psychology's value might hold a little longer than some others. Simply because when it comes to stuff like emotional management, people kind of like talking to a person rather than a computer. It makes them feel heard. And then we've got artificial intelligence, which is getting better and better at copying, emulating, imitating, mimicking, replicating, reproducing human behaviors and emotions. Which means, eventually, just like every other university degree, psychology will be fairly useless. Isn't that fun? He said sarcastically. So what do we do instead? Good question. What do we do instead? We create businesses that provide value to people. Which then get entirely automated, so the only person that sees any profit from it is the person who created the hardware, the person who created the software, and the person who bought it. So basically, if you understand computer science well enough, things might be pretty decent for you. And if you don't, life might get pretty damn hard. Many, many blunders. It's okay. Something about the whole sympathetic mental health thing, which I touched on briefly, is I often find with people, I kind of like absorb their energy. And I'm not going to be phrasing this perfectly. I'll do my best to explain how it sounds in my head. Is I take on their emotional burden unintentionally because it's just apparently how my biology works. Or there's something about how I was raised, or there's something in my biology that's very empathetic, or there's something about the way I was raised that's made me very empathetic. And what I find difficult about empathy is that it's heavy. It can be very, very heavy to be empathetic with people, especially when people have been through stuff that you haven't been through yourself, because you can do your best to relate to them and provide reasonable, sensible guidance and counsel and all that, and it's excuse me. And then you've got their lived experience as part of your life, and it's heavy, man. And then you realise that the heaviness that you're experiencing for however long you know that person, it's more so when you're experiencing that person, is what they experience all the time. All the time. And then I think it's important to remember at this point that no matter how hard you think you've got it, somebody has done better from a worse start. Somebody came up in harder conditions which you wouldn't survive and done better than you. And I think that's one of the simple truths of the matter. Somebody's always had it worse. Somebody's always been through more. It's like the idea, everybody thinks they work hard. Of course, everybody thinks they work hard. Somebody else works harder. No matter how hard you think you work, somebody else works harder. You simply can't be the hardest working person in existence. It's just impossible. How do you even measure that? You can't. I feel like I'm espouting Alex Ramosi's viewpoint from earlier on today. It's a very valid point though, is how do you measure hard work? Oh, that's a good pin, isn't it? Is it simply by hours in a day worked? Because if it is, then anybody who works every single feasible hour until the physical exhaustion forces them to rest, are they the hardest worker? Because their job might just be sitting at a desk being a security guard watching screens all day in a business, in a security console that's so simple there's nothing to watch except the front door, and the front door is, maybe like triple locked, and yeah, the front door is triple locked in a safe neighborhood, and there's other people in the building that would alert you to anything all the time. That'd be a pretty mellow job, wouldn't it? It doesn't mean you're working hard because you're doing it all day long. Hard work, there will be some people that work 2, 3, 4 hours a day that, because of the decisions they make, they require 16 hours, 20 hours, 24 hours of, if they're working 4 hours a day, and they require 20 hours of downtime to be able to recover from it to do another 4 hours the next day. Maybe that's really what hard work is. Who's to say? It's perspective, isn't it? Hard work is perspective. It's what? And it's why stuff like assigning a dollar sign to value is a tricky thing, because I get paid this much, because the society doesn't value that much. Nobody in society actually values you that much to pay you massive paychecks. I think there's a real false equivalency between size of paycheck and value to society, because there are so many jobs that are just vastly overpaid, and there's a vast amount of people who are underpaid. It does perplex me that there's this notion that your paycheck is your value as a human being. It's just not true. There's so much more that makes a human being. Ask any parent that. Ask any parent. There's so much more to their kids than a check. And any parent that sees their child as nothing more than a vestibule of profit, that's cold, man. You can say it is what it is all you want. It doesn't make you a good parent, doesn't make you a good person, it doesn't ease the idea to the kids. It's especially when so many of us are raised with the idea that if we're loving to each other and kind and supportive and do the right thing, that everything will work out fine. Because that's just not true. It's just not true. Sometimes you can do everything perfectly to the best of your absolute best ability and lose. It's like Picard says, that's life. Sometimes you do your absolute best and you lose. And I'm not trying to say that's okay. I'm saying it's okay not to be okay. And this is why I'm saying if people are better to each other, just better friends, better colleagues, better academic partners, better athletic partners, whatever you want to measure it as, just more patient with each other. Even, especially with people you don't know very well, because you never know what kind of day somebody's having. They might be all smiles and everything like that, so they might be having the worst day of their life. They might have you might come into work someday, and the person you're talking to, who's all smiles and cheery and friendly to every customer and every colleague, everything, they might have attempted suicide the night before. They might be in a position where that seems like a sensible idea. That's how rough their life, and they won't let anybody know. And maybe the your rebuttal of their "Hi, how are you?" that was that one thing that pushed them over the edge. You might never know that. You might know it immediately. We're supposed to be this highly evolved, emotionally capable society, and yet such a large proportion of us just doesn't give a damn when somebody wants to take their own life. And I don't know how else to emphasize the gravity of that. The fact